So, what if the biggest threat to a democracy isn't what we think it is? Not malice or corruption or even evil. What if it's stupidity? And I don't mean a lack of intelligence. I mean something way more deliberate and honestly, way more dangerous. Today, we're going to dig into a really provocative theory from a German theologian who stood up to Hitler and see how one writer is using it to explain a very modern political situation.
It all starts with this one powerful quote. Stupidity is more dangerous than malice. Now that comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian who was actually part of the resistance against the Nazi regime. So, this wasn't some academic theory for him. He was watching his own society completely transform, and it gave him this terrifyingly clear insight into how power and belief really work.
Okay, right off the bat, we have to be super clear about what Bonhoeffer meant by stupidity. He was not talking about someone's IQ or their level of education, not at all. For him, it was a very specific kind of moral and psychological problem. Basically, a conscious choice to just give up on thinking for yourself and to hand over your critical thought process to a powerful leader or a group.
So let's really break this theory down. Bonhoeffer's whole argument was that you can fight back against evil, right? You can expose it, you can protest it, but against this very specific, cultivated brand of stupidity, he believed we're completely defenseless. And why is that? Well, it's because this kind of stupidity refuses to even engage with reason.
And this really gets to the heart of it. Think about it. Malice, or evil, is something you can point to. You can argue against it. You can hold it accountable. But stupidity, in the way Bonhoeffer means it, is like talking to a brick wall. It doesn't care about facts or logic because it's already decided those things just don't matter. It's totally self-satisfied, and if you push it, that's when it gets really dangerous.
So, you might be thinking, okay, a theory from 1930s Germany? How does that have anything to do with today? Well, the article we're exploring here uses Bonhoeffer's framework as a lens to analyze the incredibly passionate support for a recent political leader in the Philippines.
The author makes a direct link between the dynamics Bonhoeffer saw back then and the political movement known as Dutertismo. Now that is a really bold claim, so let's take a look at the argument they lay out.
Okay, so here's the side-by-side comparison the author makes. The analysis suggests that, just like many people in 1930s Germany outsourced their thinking to one leader, a really similar thing happened in the Philippines. Only this time, the enforcers weren't on the streets. They were online trolls and influencers, all pushing a single narrative where critical thought was essentially handed over to the president.
So what does this outsourced thinking actually look like in the real world? Well, the source points to these specific behaviors. Just swallowing every single thing a leader says, from curses to excuses, buying into conspiracy theories without a second thought, and cheering on officials even when they're totally contradicting themselves. The idea here is that faith in the leader just becomes way more important than any objective facts. And this kind of behavior, it all builds up into something that, according to the source, is more than just political support. To really understand what's going on, the author says we need to look at the anatomy of the belief system itself.
And here's where the source makes its most provocative claim, that this movement starts to operate less like a political party and more like a cult. Its real power, the argument goes, doesn't come from policy debates or logical arguments, but from the endless ritual and repetition of just a few core, unshakable beliefs.
The author even points to what they call the scripture of this belief system. It's a set of really simple, really powerful phrases that get repeated over and over and over until, for the believers, they just become the truth. In this kind of environment, the source argues simple memes are treated like gospel, and a leader's curses are somehow seen as profound wisdom.
Now here's a crucial part of the author's case. They argue that this whole phenomenon isn't some accident that just happened on its own. Instead, they say, it's a carefully cultivated and incredibly effective political tool.
And this quote from the source really just hits the nail on the head. The author's point is that this kind of unthinking devotion is actually more valuable politically than having intelligent, critical supporters. And why is that? Because devotion doesn't ask tough questions. It just follows. So, based on that idea, the article lays out what it calls a 4-step playbook. Step 1, build echo chambers where any outside information is immediately dismissed as fake. Step 2, use simple, emotional memes instead of talking about complicated policy. Step 3, when you get challenged, just mock the person asking the question instead of explaining your position. And finally, step 4, mobilize that unthinking devotion you've created. So this brings us to the big picture, the real stakes. We've talked about the theory and the case study, but according to the source, the consequences of this weaponized stupidity go way beyond just one politician or one election.
The author asks us to imagine a pretty simple scenario, one that really gets to the heart of the problem for any democracy. What actually happens when you try to engage a supporter, someone who's operating in this framework, with cold, hard, objective facts?
Well, it leads to a complete and total communication breakdown. The source describes it like this. One side comes in with evidence, economic data, court rulings, human rights reports, and the other side just responds with personal attacks and labels. The argument isn't even challenged, it's just dismissed completely.
And look, this is about more than just having frustrating arguments online. The author's warning is that when a huge chunk of the public just refuses to engage with a shared set of facts, the very foundation of democracy itself just starts to corrode.
The author brings the whole thing full circle, right back to Bonhoeffer's original idea. The claim is that this isn't about intelligence, it's about a moral choice. And when that moral failing spreads across a population, it can be more destructive to a nation than any army.
And here it is, the source's final, pretty brutal verdict. It makes a really important distinction. Ignorance is just a lack of information. That can be fixed. But what's being described here, the author concludes, is a willful choice to believe, even when all the evidence says otherwise. And that, they argue, isn't ignorance, it's complicity.
And so, this whole analysis, which started with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's observations all those decades ago, leaves us with one massive and honestly pretty unsettling question for our time. In this age of information overload and powerful stories, is the willful refusal to think for ourselves the single biggest threat facing democracy today?